Queen Victoria earned the nickname of the Grandmother of Europe for the many grandchildren she had. She had 42 grandchildren in total. This 8-part series will focus on the lives of each of her grandchildren. This video will focus on the children of her eldest son, King Edward VII of the United Kingdom. Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was the eldest child of Edward VII and Alexandra of Denmark. For his entire life, he was second in line to the British throne and would have become King of the United Kingdom in 1910 had he not passed of pneumonia in 1892. His intellect and sexuality have been the subject of speculation for decades, and some even argue he could have been Jack the Ripper. Albert Victor was born on the 8th of January 1864 in Berkshire to the then Prince and Princess of Wales. He was named Albert Victor in honour of his paternal grandparents and was nicknamed Eddie by the family. He was a grandchild of two monarchs, Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom and King Christian IX of Denmark. From birth, he was second in line to the British throne after his father. His birth was unexpected, as his mother did not even realise she was in labour. It was her lady-in-waiting, Lady Macclesfield, who realised what was happening and sent for the local doctor to come quickly. Albert Victor arrived almost as soon as the doctor had arrived. Though he was 2 months premature, he was a healthy baby. Albert Victor was later joined by 2 brothers and 3 sisters, George, Louise, Victoria, Maud and Alexander John. Tragically, Alexander John passed away at 1 day old. George was born less than 2 years after Albert Victor, and the 2 boys were very close. They were educated together, and from 1871 they were educated by John Neil Dalton. They had a strict educational program which included academic subjects as well as military drills. Albert Victor did not excel academically. He was considered lazy and inattentive, and he struggled to learn foreign languages like his mother's native Danish. There was discussion of separating the 2 brothers for the remainder of their education, but Dalton advised against this, as George's company helped Albert Victor to learn. In 1877, the brothers began their naval training aboard HMS Britannia. They were 2 months behind the other cadets due to Albert Victor contracting typhoid fever. He recovered and began his naval career. In 1879, after much discussion, it was decided and agreed that the brothers would be sent on a 3-year tour aboard HMS Bacchante. On Albert Victor's 16th birthday, he was rated midshipman. During this tour, they visited the Americas, the Falkland Islands, and many more countries. While stationed in Japan, the brothers got tattoos. They later returned to Britain when Albert Victor was 18. From 1883, Albert Victor began attending Trinity College, Cambridge. He had little interest in the intellectual environment involved in student life. In August 1884, he spent some time in Heidelberg University to study German. The following year, he left Cambridge, and in 1888, Albert Victor received an honorary degree. In 1890, Queen Victoria bestowed the prince the title of Duke of Clarence and Avondale. Albert Victor's family decided the best course of action for the apathetic prince was to find a suitable wife for him. Queen Victoria encouraged him to propose to Princess Alex of Hesse and by Rhine, his first cousin and the favourite granddaughter of Queen Victoria. She rejected his proposal. Albert Victor then fell in love with Princess Helen of Orleans, who shared his feelings. However, she was Catholic and her father refused to allow her to convert to Anglicanism and did not allow the match to go ahead. Eventually, Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, more commonly known as Mary of Teck, was suggested as a suitable bride. She was a second cousin once removed of Albert Victor, through their shared ancestor of King George III. Albert Victor did not resist the match, and Mary was agreeable as well. Mary's father was the son of a morganatic marriage, which presented Mary with difficulties on the marriage market. Mary was proud to be a member of the British royal family, and she felt it was her duty to marry Prince Albert Victor. Albert Victor proposed to Mary in December 1891. The engagement was announced on the 6th of December 1891, with the wedding set for the 27th of February 1892. In 1889, a gay brothel was uncovered by the police. At the time, all homosexual acts between men were illegal, and those convicted could face 2 years' imprisonment with hard labour. High-ranking figures in British society were implicated, and rumours emerged that Prince Albert Victor had visited the brothel. Though he had not been named by the prostitutes, the rumours spread like crazy. It has been suggested that Arthur Newsham, the lawyer for one of the clients of the brothel, had fabricated and spread the rumours to take the heat off his own client. The Prince of Wales intervened, and no clients were prosecuted, and nothing against Prince Albert Victor was proven. Around this time, Albert Victor went on a planned 7-month tour of India. While on this tour, Albert Victor met Marjorie Haydon. She would later come to England and claim that Albert Victor was the father of her son Clarence. This would later be proven false because of Clarence's birth certificate. On his birth certificate, his birth year was listed as 1887, 2 years before Prince Albert Victor had ever met Marjorie Haydon. On the 7th of January 1892, Albert Victor fell ill with influenza. Several other household members, including Albert Victor's sister Victoria, fell ill with influenza as well. Albert Victor's lungs became inflamed and he developed pneumonia. On the 14th of January 1892, 6 days after his 28th birthday, Albert Victor died, with his parents, his siblings, his fiancée and his fiancée's mother at his bedside. His death rocked his family. Both his parents were devastated to have lost a second child, with his father even declaring that he would have given up his own life for Albert Victor. At his funeral, his former fiancée placed what would have been her wedding bouquet on his coffin. During their shared grief, Mary and George grew close and would eventually marry. Albert Victor's life was brief but eventful. One of Britain's lost kings, his story has been overshadowed by rumours and what-ifs related to most parts of his short life. George V was born on the 3rd of June 1865 in London. He was the second son of Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, the then Prince and Princess of Wales. He was a grandchild of Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom through his father and Christian IX of Denmark through his mother. As the second son, George was never expected to one day be king. George and his older brother Albert Victor were educated together, and neither of them excelled academically. At the age of 12, George and Albert Victor began training in the Navy, and from 1879, both of the brothers served on HMS Bacchante. They toured the British Empire together. Unable to speak French or German, their grandmother, Queen Victoria, sent them to Lausanne, which resulted in very little learning of either language. As an adult, George continued to work in the Navy, serving under his uncle, Prince Alfred. While stationed in Malta, he fell in love with his cousin, Princess Marie of Edinburgh. Their mothers disliked the match. Alexandra thought the family too pro-German, and Marie's mother disliked England. Marie refused George and instead married Ferdinand, the future king of Romania. In 1891, Albert Victor proposed to Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, more commonly known as Mary. But 6 weeks later, in January 1892, Albert Victor died of pneumonia, caused by influenza. George was thrust into second in the line of succession. Queen Victoria pushed her grandchild to propose to Mary. George and Mary grew closer together during their shared mourning, and in 1893 George proposed. Mary accepted. That same year, on the 6th of July 1893, George and Mary were wed. They remained devoted to each other, never being unfaithful. George was unable to express how he felt in speech, but he wrote many letters to his wife, as did she, expressing their devotion and love for each other. George's career in the Navy ended when he became second in line. He was given the title of Duke of York in 1892 and began to receive constitutional history lessons. George and Mary would go on to have 5 sons and a daughter together. He and Mary were strict and distant with their children, not much different to how royalty raised their children at the time. They lived in York Cottage on the Sandringham estate and led a simple, quiet life. On the 22nd of January 1901, Queen Victoria passed away, and George's father ascended the throne. George was then given the title of Prince of Wales and toured the British Empire with his wife. As Prince of Wales, George was given access to state documents, unlike how his father had been when he was Prince of Wales. And George also allowed his wife to read the papers. He valued her advice, and she helped him to write speeches. George supported reforms in naval training, with cadets being enrolled at the age of 12 and receiving the same education regardless of class. These reforms were eventually implemented. On the 6th of May 1910, Edward VII died and George became king. He took the regnal name of George V. George took offence to the anti-Catholic wording of the Ascension Declaration that he was supposed to make during the opening of Parliament. He refused to open Parliament unless the offensive phrases were changed, and the Ascension Declaration Act of 1910 was passed, which removed the phrases. On the 22nd of June 1911, George and Mary were crowned together at Westminster Abbey. That same year they travelled to India for the Delhi Durbar, where they were crowned Emperor and Empress of India. He was the only Emperor of India to actually be present at his own Delhi Durbar. While in India, he expressed disgust at the racial segregation. When George came to the throne, the People's Budget had been rejected by the House of Lords, which was unusual as Lords normally did not veto budget bills. The Prime Minister attempted to reduce the power of the Lords, but it kept being blocked. The Prime Minister asked George to grant another general election and to create sufficient Liberal peers if the Lords blocked legislation again. George agreed to the dissolution, and the Parliament Act of 1911 was passed, which removed the power of the Lords to veto bills. On the 4th of August 1914, World War I began. Britain and its allies were at war with the German Empire and its allies. George and his family were cousins of the German Kaiser and bore German titles. In a response to the growing anti-German sentiment at the time, George changed the royal house's surname to Windsor in 1917, and all of his British relatives relinquished their German titles. He gave his male relatives British peerages and titles. That same year, he restricted who could have the style of Royal Highness and who could have the title of Prince or Princess. By 1919, any of George's relatives who had fought on the German side of the war had their British peerages and titles revoked. In 1917, George's first cousin, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia, was overthrown in the Russian Revolution. George initially decided to grant his cousins asylum, but revoked his offer after fears of revolution being sparked in the UK. The Tsar, his wife and children were murdered in 1918. George sent a British warship to Russia to rescue the extended members of the Russian imperial family. 2 months after the end of the First World War, Prince John, the king's youngest son, died at the age of 13 from an epileptic fit. His death caused immense grief for both of his parents. From 1932, George began to deliver a royal Christmas speech on the radio. He would continue this every year. By 1935, after 25 years on the throne, George was much loved by the British people. George's relationship with his heir Edward, or David as he was called in the family, deteriorated as the years went on. George was disappointed that Edward had failed to settle down and start a family. He was appalled by his affairs with married women also. In stark contrast, he was fond of Albert, his second son, who had married and had 2 daughters who George doted on. George's health began to suffer as he aged. He smoked heavily, and by 1935 he was also taking oxygen. The death of his sister Victoria in December 1935 affected him. He became depressed, and this weakened his already poor health. From the middle of January 1936, he grew weaker and drifted in and out of consciousness. On the 20th of January 1936, the king's doctor administered a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine to the king to put him out of his suffering. The royal family were not aware of his actions, and the cause of the king's death did not come to light until the 1980s, when the doctor's diaries were published. George's eldest son, Edward, succeeded as Edward VIII, but abdicated by the end of the year in favour of Albert, who ascended the throne as George VI. Princess Louise, Princess Royal and Duchess of Fife, was the eldest daughter and 3rd child of Edward VII of the United Kingdom and Alexandra of Denmark. Known for being shy and quiet, Louise was a low-key member of the British royal family. Louise's birth was not without difficulty. Her mother, Alexandra, became ill with rheumatic fever during her pregnancy. Her mother was encouraged not to use chloroform, a painkiller, during the labour because the doctors felt it would worsen the Princess of Wales' condition. The labour was painful as a result when Louise entered the world on the 20th of February 1867. Louise grew up with 3 brothers and 2 sisters: Albert Victor, George, Victoria, Maud and Alexander John. Tragically, Alexander John passed away at 1 day old. Louise was a granddaughter of 2 European monarchs, Christian IX of Denmark and Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom. Unlike their mother, Louise and her sisters were not considered to be conventionally beautiful, and they were nicknamed the Hags. They received a minimal education. The sisters were shy and quiet in public, and they often appeared to be quite withdrawn. However, in private, they were lively and flourished. Being possessive of Louise and her sisters, their mother did not want them to marry. Despite attempts to keep her daughters by her side unmarried, Louise married Alexander Duff, 6th Earl Fife, on the 27th of July 1889 at the age of 22. He was 17 years older than her, and her 3rd cousin through their mutual ancestor George III of the United Kingdom. Alexander's descent was via William IV and his longtime mistress Dorothea Jordan. Louise's grandmother, Queen Victoria, created Alexander the Duke of Fife and Marquess of Macduff 2 days after the wedding. Despite their significant age difference, they were well matched and led a loving married life together. After their honeymoon, they settled down in the Duke's country estate in Scotland. Louise soon became an expert at salmon fishing. The couple had 3 children together: Alistair, Alexandra and Maud. Alistair was stillborn. In 1900, when it became apparent that the Duke and Duchess were unlikely to have any more children, and thus no son to inherit the dukedom, Queen Victoria issued an unusual letters patent for the time. Queen Victoria created a 2nd dukedom of Fife along with the earldom of Macduff, with a special remainder. In the event that there was no male heir, the peerages would pass to the daughters of the 1st Duke, and then to their male descendants. In 1901, Queen Victoria passed away, and Louise's father became Edward VII. In 1905, Louise was created Princess Royal, and her daughters were granted the title of Princess with the style of Highness. The king was discouraged from doing this, but he ordered that it be done. Prince George, Prince of Wales, Louise's brother and the future King George V, was disturbed by this act. In December 1911, Louise and her family set off to spend the winter in Egypt and Sudan, where the weather was more beneficial to Louise's health. Their ship went aground off the coast of Morocco and they were shipwrecked. The Duke developed pneumonia and died on the 29th of January 1912 in Egypt. Alexandra succeeded as the Duchess of Fife in her own right. After this, Louise led a somewhat reclusive life. She would occasionally accompany her mother and her sister Victoria to public events. In her later years, Louise suffered from heart disease. In October 1929, she fell ill with gastric hemorrhage and was treated for it in London. 15 months later, she passed away in her sleep on the 4th of January 1931. Princess Victoria of the United Kingdom was the second daughter and fourth child of Edward VII of the United Kingdom and Alexandra of Denmark. Known as Toria in the family, she was a favourite sister of George V. Victoria was born on the 6th of July 1868. She grew up with 5 siblings: Albert Victor, George, Louise, Maud and Alexander John. Tragically, Alexander John passed away when he was only 1 day old. Victoria was close to her sisters. They were not conventionally beautiful and developed shy personalities as a result. They received a minimal education. Victoria would spend summertime in Denmark, her mother's homeland. Their mother Alexandra was possessive of her daughters and did everything she could to prevent them from marrying and leaving her. Victoria did have several suitors, including Prince Adolphus of Teck, Sir Arthur Davidson, and Archibald Primrose, 5th Earl of Rosebery. In his youth, Tsar Nicholas II of Russia was in love with Victoria, loving her for her seriousness and unfeminine mind. Another suitor included the future Christian X of Denmark. She rejected him, which displeased both of her parents, even her mother, who was opposed to her daughters marrying. Archibald Primrose, 5th Earl of Rosebery, and Victoria held mutual affection for each other, and they would have liked to have married. However, Victoria's mother discouraged her from marrying anyone, and Victoria took this to heart. She remained her mother's companion until Alexandra's death in 1925. Victoria was a passionate photographer and compiled several albums of family photographs, some of which went on display at exhibitions. Victoria adored animals and even tamed a pigeon, which she would take with her on walks. Throughout her life, Victoria was very close to her brother George, and they maintained a warm, loving relationship. In adulthood, they would share daily phone calls. George would pass away only a month after Victoria. Victoria was close to both of her parents. She accompanied them during their official events and ceremonies. When Victoria's mother died in 1925, Victoria was finally able to live her own life at long last. She purchased a home for herself in Buckinghamshire and became an active member of village life in the village of Iver. In her will, she left her home to her nephew Prince George, Duke of Kent. In her final years, Victoria suffered from neuralgia, migraines, indigestion and depression. She passed away on the 3rd of December 1935. Maud, Queen of Norway, was the youngest daughter of Edward VII and Alexandra of Denmark. She became Queen Consort of Norway through her marriage to Håkon VII of Norway. Maud was born on the 26th of November 1869. Her siblings were Albert Victor, George, Louise, Victoria and Alexander John. Tragically, Alexander John passed away at 1 day old. As a child, Maud was the most cheerful of her sisters. She was a tomboy and was nicknamed Harry. She and her sisters received a minimal education. As a young woman, Maud fell in love with Prince Francis of Teck, but he did not share her feelings. She and her family would visit Denmark every summer. During these visits, she became close to her cousin Prince Karl of Denmark, the future Håkon VII of Norway. They fell in love and were wed on the 22nd of July 1896. Maud's father Albert, the future Edward VII, gave them Appleton House on the Sandringham estate for Maud to use when visiting England. They spent their honeymoon in Appleton House. Maud was reluctant to leave England, so the couple continued to live in England for 5 months after the wedding. They moved to Denmark in December 1896 and took up residence in Bernstorff Palace. Maud found the Danish winters unbearable and visited England as often as she could. 7 years after their wedding, Maud gave birth to their only child, Alexander, in 1903. 2 years later, the union between Sweden and Norway ended, and the Norwegian government began searching for candidates to become the King of Norway. Karl was chosen due to his descent from previous Norwegian monarchs and his marriage to a British princess. Before he accepted the kingship, Karl insisted a referendum be held so that the Norwegian people could have a say in whether or not they wanted to retain the monarchy. After it became clear that the Norwegian people were in favour of a monarchy being retained, with Karl as the monarch, Karl accepted the throne. He arrived in Norway on the 25th of November 1905 and took the oath as king 2 days later. He took the name Håkon VII, and his 2-year-old son was renamed Olaf. Maud and Karl were crowned king and queen on the 22nd of June 1906. Maud and Karl ensured their son would be raised in Norway as a Norwegian, and that he would learn the language. Maud herself never became fluent in Norwegian, and she never gave up her love for England. She did fulfill her duties as Queen of Norway, becoming active in women's rights and the welfare of unmarried women. She founded the Queen's Relief Committee during the First World War to assist people in difficult circumstances. Her last public appearance in the United Kingdom was in 1937 during the coronation of her grandnephew George VI. In October 1938, while staying in London, she fell ill and had to have abdominal surgery. She survived the surgery but died on the 20th of November 1938, 6 days before her 69th birthday from heart failure. Her remains were transported to Norway, where she was buried. Maud was the last surviving child of Edward VII and Alexandra of Denmark. Her husband would survive her by 19 years. Prince Alexander John of Wales was the youngest child of Edward VII of the United Kingdom and Alexandra of Denmark. He was born premature on the 6th of April 1871 in Sandringham House. Due to being born premature, he was a sickly baby and passed away less than a day later on the 7th of April 1871.